Would you ask Mr. Marshall to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Marshall. Well, let's see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Marshall, welcome back. There are one or two questions that arise out of your evidence that I want to pursue a little bit further. First, this morning you told us about deemed to satisfy, or akin to deemed to satisfy, and you related that to Regulation 7. Can I show you what you said in the transcript so that we can work from that? Today's transcript, please, day 226, page 80, line 7. I was asking you about the 2016 guidance, and I asked you at line 7 how the approach in that guidance was consistent with the provisions of approved document B. And you said, as I've mentioned, it's akin to a deemed to satisfy route that exists under Regulation 7. You remember that evidence?
Yes.
Yes. Let's look at Regulation 7, if we can. Can we please have up INQ 14930? Now, this is the approved document relating to Regulation 7, isn't it?
Yes.
When you refer to Regulation 7, were you referring to this document?
Yes.
Right. Can we therefore go in it, please, to page 14? And I should just, to remind you, explain, and you probably know more about this than me, that Part 1 of this document deals with materials and Part 2 deals with workmanship. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, in order to deal with the two basic topics covered by the regulation itself. Now, here on page 14 at the top of the page, you can see something with a title, Past Experience. Paragraph 1.18, past experience, such as use in an existing building, may show that the material can perform the function for which it is intended. First, was that the provision in Regulation 7 to which you were intending to refer this morning?
Yes.
It was, right. In the context of the publication of the 2016 guidance, could you just tell us what was the experience which showed that ACM Class B, when used with K15 or RS 5000 in a building above 18 metres, can meet the functional requirement B4 Part 1?
It was based on the number of Option 3 assessments that had been presented to us.
So past experience of desktop assessments?
Yes.
Not past experience of actual buildings in real life?
Well, they would have been constructed at some point, yes.
Well, sorry, desktop assessments, I thought, were based on data from 8414 tests, weren't they? Not based on a survey of existing buildings?
No, sorry, I meant those assessments would have been used to construct buildings.
Right. The desktop assessments, you mean?
Yes.
Right. So, just so I'm absolutely clear, your regulatory justification, if I can use that expression, was past experience of desktops under Option 3, not past experience of buildings in the built environment.
Yes.
And not past experience of the test data itself. In other words, not the experience of the tests, but the interpolation of the tests.
Yes.
Yes, I see. Thank you. Next question is as follows. You, I think, accept that there was a lack of clarity in general about the meaning and purpose of 12.7 by 2016, yes?
Which aspect of 12.7?
Well, let me put it slightly differently. By 2016, were you aware that there was a controversy, a degree of divergence of understanding in the industry about whether 12.7 meant that all elements of the external wall, including external facings, had to be of material of limited combustibility. There
Yes.
are some people who thought it should, and there, like you, and there are some people who thought that it shouldn't.
Yes.
Yes. And were you aware also that there were concerns by that time, among others expressed by people like Nick Jenkins at Booth Murie, about the number of buildings in the built environment which had been built using PE cord ACM panels? Yes?
I'm aware of that, yes.
Yes. Do you know whether the NHBC board and indeed NHBC's underwriting department was willing to continue to accept the risks presented by those materials, given the controversies and concerns that surrounded them?
The underwriting and the board were accepting of following the options within the approved document through options 1 to 4. They weren't, and the discussion we had yesterday around filler, etc., that was clear within NHBC, and it was one of the reasons that when we did the 2015 review, we instigated the same criteria on warranty-only schemes so that we could be satisfied that that criteria was being applied consistently.
Do you accept that the risk presented by using K15 and ACM cord, PE cord panels, whether together or separately, increased as a result of the introduction of your 2016 guidance?
No.
You don't?
No, because the guidance, the restrictions on use made it clear.
To your knowledge, was the board ever asked to undertake its own separate risk assessment or analysis, or was the underwriting department ever invited to do so that they could work out for themselves whether that document did, or as you say, didn't, increase the risk either of a claim or of a wrong certification?
The board were regularly updated on the activities of the business, and I don't know the content of those updates. They would have been recorded in board minutes.
Can we then turn to the speech you gave to the Tall Building Seminar itself on the 7th of July 2016? We'll find that at INQ 30148112, please. And this is the transcript of that, which we have created by EPIC. And if you go down, please, in it to page 4, in the middle of your speech, you say, in the middle of the screen, it has created a little bit of confusion in the industry that why does NHBC get involved in building control matters when they're only providing warranty? NHBC are the warranty body who takes responsibility for you to comply with standards and regulations. So the two sit very much hand in hand. Why is it important, you say? Well, this image is the first of several that you'll see this afternoon on buildings that have had fires, and they do cause headlines because they're quite spectacular. What we want to do is obviously avoid that situation. Ultimately, if things do go wrong, then it's the threat of prosecution. As a building control body, we can lose our license. We can be prosecuted for corporate manslaughter. Fines and imprisonment can follow. Not a position we want to be in, obviously. From a claims perspective under our warranty, if we turn the page, if there are deaths and injuries and any damage, we don't want to be dealing with those sorts of claims. Can you explain why the safety of residents living in buildings which were potentially unsafe found no mention in your speech? Only the impact to NHBC in terms of criminal and civil liability. Can you explain that?
So could you scroll back up, please?
Yes. Page 4.
I think I haven't obviously seen this previously, other than delivering it on the day in 2016. The context was around compliance and achieving standards, and the whole point that was being made here was we were regularly challenged as NHBC on why we were asking regulatory questions on warranty-only schemes, because we weren't the building control body. And we had that challenge not only from other building control bodies, but from customers submitting information. And this point is to make it clear that where we have the responsibility for warranty, we were seeing inconsistencies on the application and interpretation of Approved Document B, and we wanted to address that. So the background was driving compliance and improving standards.
You see, the reason I ask the question is that there's a list of consequences that you're seeking to avoid, and I've read them to you, but one can see that it doesn't include the consequences for individuals actually living in these buildings, and I just wanted to know why that was.
I think that was taken as a given. We were looking at compliance, and that's stated further up, compliance with standards and compliance with regulations that ensure buildings are safe.
Now, we've covered a huge amount of evidence over the last day and a half, Marshall, and I just have a final question for you, and that is, looking back on the material that we've covered and looking back on your experience in dealing with these materials in the high-rise context from 2013, is there anything you would like now to have done differently?
I think we recognise that the issues with Kingspan could have been drawn to a conclusion far swifter. The approach that we took in relation to the acceptability guide was done at the time with the industry knowledge, and obviously in light of significant testing, there are questions over some of the content. I think what we are looking to do is obviously cooperate as necessary with the inquiry, and we stand ready to implement any recommendations that come out of the inquiry that has an impact on our operations.
Well, thank you very much. Ms. Marshall, it remains for me to thank you very much for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations. That's the end of my questions, and I'm extremely grateful to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I should thank you as well, Ms. Marshall, for coming to give evidence. We've learned a lot from hearing your testimony, and it'll be very helpful to us when we come to consider our decisions in due course. So thank you very much, and you're now free to go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Millett. Now, we do have another witness, do we not?
We do. We have the next witness for UCAS lined up to come to give evidence, and as soon as we've done the necessary changeover process, she will be taken by Ms. Emma Hines of Council.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, in the usual way, we'll have to have a short break now so that we can do the usual housekeeping process, and maybe you could ask the usher to come and find us as soon as that's ready.
Very well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Hines. Now you have a witness for us.
Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon to members of the panel. May I please call Mrs. Lorraine Turner of the United Kingdom Accreditation Service?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Ms. Turner. I gather you're going to affirm.
Yes.
Thank you. Would you read the words on the screen in front of you then, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now please sit down and make yourself comfortable. All right?
Yes.
Very good. Yes, Ms. Hines.
Thank you, sir. Mrs. Turner, thank you very much for coming to the inquiry. If you've any difficulty in understanding any of my questions, please just say, and I'll either repeat the question or I'll put it in a different way. We're going to take a scheduled break this afternoon, but if you need a break at any other time, please just let me know. And would you please try and keep your voice up so the transcriber can hear you and take down your evidence? It also helps not to nod or shake your head, but to actually say yes or no, so it goes down on the transcript. And Mrs. Turner, today you might be tempted to use a lot of acronyms, and I might be tempted to follow you in using those acronyms. Can I ask you to try and say those terms in full, unless they're extremely well-known terms? You've made 2 witness statements for the inquiry. Can we please go to UKAS 2011242? This is your statement dated the 10th of September 2021, and I'll call this your first statement. Can we go, please, to page 21? There's a signature there. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
Can we now go to UKAS 2011422? This is your statement dated the 22nd of December 2021, and I'll call this your second statement. Can we please go to page 14? And is that your signature you see there?
Yes, it is.
Have you read each of these statements recently?
Yes, I have.
Now, with regard to your first statement, at page 5, paragraph 7c, you said that 2,650 bodies were accredited by UCAS. What's that figure now?
It's, I think, over 3,100 organisations.
And at page 7, paragraph 7f, you gave a list of board members. Has that list changed?
Yes, it has. Paul Greenwood, our operations director, was appointed to the board in October 2021.
And there was no one removed from the board, it's just an addition?
No.
Now, subject to those 2 clarifications, can you confirm that the contents of your statements are true?
Yes, I can.
Have you discussed the evidence you're going to give today with anyone before coming here?
Just my legal team and colleagues, consulted colleagues on points of facts to get information from our records.
Very well. Now, I understand that you have a bachelor's degree in chemistry and a master's degree in analytical chemistry. Is that right?
That's correct.
Do you also hold an Institute of Directors certificate in company direction?
I do.
And you tell us in your first statement that from 1991 you managed the Scientific Services Laboratory at the London Borough of Islington. Is that correct?
I was, a senior analyst at the London Borough of Islington.
And in July 1995, did you join the National Measurement Accreditation Service, or otherwise known as NAMAS?
Yes, I did.
And was that in the Chemical, Biological, Health and Hygiene section?
Yes, it was.
Was that an accreditation role?
Yes, it was. At the time, it was called a technical officer role. It's now that same role is now called an assessment manager.
And in August 1995, so a few months or even weeks into that employment, did NAMAS become part of the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, or UCAS?
Yes, UCAS was formed on the 1st of August from NAMAS and another organisation.
Was that NATLAS?
No, it was the NACCB, which was the accreditation body for certification bodies.
Right. And I understand that you've had a number of roles at UCAS since then. In 1999, you were appointed to the role of Accreditation Manager of the Chemistry section, is that right?
Yes.
And in 2005, you were appointed to a new role, Technical Manager for UCAS, is that right?
Yes.
Was that for accreditation related just to chemistry, or was your remit broader?
It was a broader remit. It was a cross-company role. It was a new role that was created to start to coordinate our technical policy functions at the time, because the organisation had grown, and so we decided to centralise some functions.
I see. In 2009, were you appointed to the role of Divisional Director Technical?
Yes, I was.
And was that in the executive team?
Yes.
And as Divisional Director, was your focus on chemistry-related accreditation, or was it broader?
No, again, it was broader. So now the technical team moved from just being one person to we started to increase the team. And I also took on the responsibility for the quality management system, UKAS's own quality management system.
I see. And in May 2012, I understand there was another reorganisation of UCAS, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And were you appointed at that time to the role of Technical and Business Development Director?
Yes, I was.
And in your first statement, you say that in this role, your responsibilities included executive responsibility for the technical and quality function, external affairs, marketing and communications, and new service development. Was this a role that looked across all areas of UCAS, or did you return to more of a focus on chemical or environmental services?
No, it's a cross-organisation role.
Very well. And when you say you have executive responsibility for the technical and quality function, can we take it from that from 2012 you were ultimately responsible for the performance of accreditation services?
I was responsible for the sort of technical management, technical policy side, the delivery of assessment and accreditation activities falls under the operations director. But we worked and continue to work very closely together in terms of delivery of assessments and ensuring our technical integrity.
Thank you. In January 2021, were you appointed as the accreditation director?
Yes, I was.
Now, you tell us in your first statement that in that role you had a responsibility for, and I'm quoting, setting, driving and maintaining technical policy, customer service standards and management of business risks. Are you now the most senior person at UCAS responsible for accreditation?
I would say that the most senior person at UCAS responsible for accreditation would be our chief executive, but responsibilities are delegated at the executive level across the executive team. And I've provided, I think, in my witness statement, the structure of that team.
We will come to the structure of that team in a moment. Can we say, though, for now, that looking at all of this together, you've had a long history at UCAS. Is it fair to say that, however, you don't have a great deal of personal knowledge of the accreditation of fire testing, of certification, or construction products?
That's correct. I'm not an expert in fire testing or certification of construction products. My expertise, I would say now, is more general accreditation across the different areas of accreditation.
Can I put it this way, that you don't have detailed knowledge of or personal involvement in some of the events that this inquiry has been looking at, but you do have detailed knowledge of accreditation policy and procedure at UCAS?
That's correct.
And you've had that knowledge since UCAS was formed, in fact?
Yes.
And it's on that basis that you're giving evidence today, is that correct?
That's correct.
I want to turn now to ask you some questions about UCAS as an organisation. UCAS is the National Accreditation Body, or NAB, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And we've noticed that UCAS was formed in 1995. Was UCAS recognised at that time as the sole national body for accreditation?
Yes, it was, but in a slightly different way to the current position.
Well, in fact, turning to the events of 2008, 2009, I understand that the European Union introduced a new regulation called the Regulation on Accreditation and Market Surveillance, and that introduced a requirement that EU member states appointed a single national accreditation body. Is that your understanding?
It is.
And UCAS was the organisation that became appointed under that EU regulation, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, when the UK withdrew from the European Union in 2020, to put it in simple terms, we retained the law that required there be a national accreditation body. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Does it follow that there's currently a requirement for there to be a national accreditation body, a legal requirement?
In the accreditation regulations, yes, and the amended regulations post the exiting of EU.
Yes, and that body is and was UCAS.
Yes.
Is accreditation by UCAS voluntary? By which I mean, it isn't mandatory for a facility to have UCAS accreditation to operate?
That depends. In some areas, it is mandatory. There may be legislation that requires organisations to hold accreditation. In other areas, it may be a voluntary decision for a business to choose that they want to have a third-party attestation of their competence. And there are some scenarios where there might be policy recommendations to use accredited organisations, and so the motivations, the drivers for organisations to become accredited may vary in the different sectors.
Is it mandatory for a laboratory conducting fire testing on construction products to have UCAS accreditation to operate?
I'm not entirely sure whether that's actually written into the legislation. I am aware that the reference to the use of accredited laboratories for fire testing. That's not. I'm not certain.
Are you referring to, for example, statutory guidance that
Yes.
says UCAS
Yes.
accredited laboratories? But there could be a laboratory conducting certain tests, but would not necessarily require UCAS accreditation in order to legally be conducting those tests.
Yes, I understand that to be the case, but I'm not 100% certain, but that's what I believe.
Very well. Since UCAS was formed in 1995, it's operated under a memorandum of understanding with government, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
And was that initially with what was then called the Department for Trade and Industry?
Yes.
Or the Department of Trade and Industry? Have clarification on that if I'm wrong. Over time, that relevant government department has changed, hasn't it?
Yes.
Which department does UCAS deal with now?
UCAS sits under BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy.
But UCAS itself is not a government department.
No, we're not.
Would you say that UCAS is independent of government?
Yes, we are.
Would you say that UCAS is sponsored by BEIS?
That is terminology we use, yes.
How do you describe the sponsorship?
Well, the sponsorship is not a financial arrangement. I think it's probably a casual term to reference the relationship through the Memorandum of Understanding through the MOU, because now our appointment since 2008, 2009 as the national accreditation body. That's probably the more accurate way of describing the relationship.
So you would say you were the appointed body?
Yes.
Sir Martin, I'm not sure if you'd finished your question.
I had, thank you. I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you very much. In fact, let's go to one of the Memoranda of Understanding. Can we go to UCAS 11260, please? This is the Memorandum of Understanding dated December 2009, and we can see from the front that it's with the department then known as BIS, BIS. Now, there are several other memoranda, but I'll refer to this one for the moment because it covers the period from 2009 to 2017. Can we please turn to page 4? And at the top, we see paragraph 5. And it's fees and charging. And it says, UCAS may charge fees to cover costs and other expenditure and will ensure that its fee charging arrangements are fair and reasonable. UCAS will publish details of its fees and charges. Can we now go to page 5 and we see paragraph 9? And paragraph 9 is about support from government. Can we focus in on clause 9.3? And it says, the activities of UCAS will generally be self-financing from fees charged to customers. However, the Secretary of State will consider requests from UCAS for financial assistance to assist the initial establishment of new services, where these are required to support government policy, and activities aimed at raising the awareness of accreditation where it would be unreasonable for UCAS to meet these costs from its own resources, as well as requests from UCAS for financial assistance on a project-specific basis in respect of UCAS international activities. So is the default position then that UCAS does not generally rely on government funding to perform routine accreditation services?
That's correct.
And in fact, that's always been the case, that UCAS has never relied on government funding to perform routine accreditation.
That's correct.
Does UCAS finance its operations by charging fees for those services?
Yes.
And again, it always has done so.
Yes.
Nonetheless, I think it's your evidence that UCAS is a not-for-profit organisation. Is that right?
That's correct.
Does that mean that UCAS doesn't distribute profit?
It does.
And UCAS doesn't have shareholders, it has members. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'll come back to members in a moment. I just want to stay with clause 9.3. It says that UCAS might get financial assistance from government, 3 lines from the bottom, third line from the top, to assist the initial establishment of new services where these are required to support government policy. What sort of government policies is the memorandum referring to here?
If there are new regulations that call up the need to develop accreditation in new areas, it might be that we have a process for doing that, and it might be that we receive some funding from government to support the development activity. So setting up the criteria, the process that we will use, finding the right expertise, and so on.
I see. Can we go down now to page 10 of the Memorandum of Understanding? This is Appendix 3, and it sets out the position on how the government department monitors UCAS. In the second paragraph, we see a list of circular bullet points, and this is a list of documents that at that time UCAS was required to send to the department. And at the third paragraph, if we can scroll down to that, we can see that the department will also monitor UCAS through regular meetings, participation in UCAS activities, and independent reviews. And you tell us in your second statement that at the present moment, UCAS will be in contact with BEIS approximately weekly for ad hoc matters. Is that right?
Yes, I would say that is typically the case.
And what sort of matters would UCAS be in contact with BEIS about?
They vary. If I just think of an example, one of the most recent relates to some feedback that had come into the department about UCAS activities overseas. So they'll ask for some information to verify. Occasionally, there may be inquiries, and as you might imagine, during the period leading up to exiting the EU and the amendment to the regulations and so on. That was quite an intense time. We're also, UCAS accreditation is used to as part of the process for recognising approved bodies, previously called notified bodies, and BEIS as a government department is a competent authority. So there are many different strands to the relationship that we have with them.
Can you just explain, you've used the term notified bodies, would you just explain what you mean by that?
Notified body is it's a pre-Brexit term for conformity assessment bodies, so laboratories, certification bodies that were recognised, notified to the European Commission as being bodies that could carry out assessment activities of products in accordance with European legislation, so related to product safety. And post-Brexit, that we have a similar system that's continued, but with those bodies are now called approved bodies.
Would I be right to describe them as something like a mutual recognition arrangement?
They were bodies, so prior to exiting the EU, they were bodies that could do that assessment work, and that work would be recognised throughout Europe. As being equivalent.
Right. Now, that's the position now or in the last few years. Would you say that UCAS has worked with its government department in that way throughout your time?
Yes, I think, and I've been involved with the relationship with BEIS and its predecessors since moving into the technical manager's role, and yes, I think so. Of course, it changes depending on the demand, but it's a good, effective relationship, I would say.
When I say government department, of course, I mean BEIS and any of its predecessors. Would you say that the government department has a great deal of oversight of UCAS's work?
I think they have access to a lot of information. I think it depends what you mean by oversight. They don't have any influence on the accreditation decisions that we make, but they're consulted as part of our Policy Advisory Council. They're consulted on a one-to-one basis on things like fees and any other complaints and things like that. So oversight, I think I would say that they have a good view of what happens at UCAS, and they have access to any information that they need to satisfy themselves of our performance and operation.
Can the government department direct UCAS policies?
No, they can't.
Can it direct any actions for UCAS to take?
No, it can't.
Can the government department influence UCAS on policies or actions?
They would have input into, and we would potentially seek advice from them.
Would UCAS be free to take its own course, though?
Yes, we would, as long as we continue to operate in accordance with the Memorandum of Understanding and the regulations.
Does UCAS deal with or have a relationship with any other government departments? For example, the MHCLG, as it was formerly known, now known as the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities?
We don't have that department, MHCLG, is not a UCAS member or a member of the list of sort of formal members of UCAS. We have lots of interaction with the department in relation to different schemes and different activities that fall within the scope of that government department's work.
How do you interact with that department, for instance?
With meetings, we participate in a lot of sort of joint groups and committees or groups that might be run with the department.
And you said that some other departments were members. Can you tell us who those departments are?
The Department of Health is one. The Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. There is a list actually in my
we shan't go to it unless we need to. I'm just trying to get a general picture of the interaction that UCAS has with government. Can we go, just to talk about the general structure of UCAS, can we go to your first statement at page 6? That's code UCAS 0011242, page 6, thank you. And we see at the bottom there's an organogram. And at the top, we see bays and a reference to the MOU. And to the side, we see the UCAS members, which we've mentioned. Now, members are, I think, mostly industry associations, professional institutions, and government departments, aren't they?
Yes, they fall into, probably broadly speaking, four categories that represent the interested parties.
Well, I've only named 3, so which have I missed? Industry associations, government departments, professional institutions.
And there is our direct customers are also represented in the members through associations. So the British Measurement Testing Association, SAFED, which is an association of inspection bodies, and the ABCB, which is the Association of British Certification Bodies.
When you say direct customers, you mean organisation that UCAS accredits?
Yes.
Now, just returning to the organogram, we've got under the MOU, we've got the board and the chief executive. That role is now held by Matt Gantley, is that right?
That's correct.
Previously it was Paul Stennett, wasn't it?
Yes.
Now, to the side, we see Policy Advisory Forum, PAF, and Policy Advisory Council. Now, it may seem silly, but presumably they advise UCAS on policy.
Yes.
Accreditation policy included.
Yes.
Now, is the council the smaller steering group of the two?
Yes, it is.
Now, do those groups include, as you say, direct customers, so bodies that UCAS accredits?
Associations of direct customers rather than individual customers.
I see. So the associations that you've mentioned.
Yes, and others, which might be specific to a technical area.
I see. And do those groups include indirect customers, by which I mean, for example, a manufacturer who might have their product certified or tested in one of your direct customers?
Yes, but again, not an individual manufacturer, but perhaps a trade association of similar manufacturer members.
How are consumers represented on this group?
Consumers are there are some organisations that are members of the Policy Advisory Forum that would represent end users, but it is an area that is quite difficult sometimes for us to get engagement. We have had various attempts, both at our sort of formal members and also in the Policy Advisory Forum, to expand that. It's an area where, in fact, it's a current objective we have. It's been continuous. Right.
Just returning to the organogram, we can see under the CEO there's a number of departments. We're starting from the left, commercial, and then towards the right, operations and technical, business development and external affairs. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, is it right that your role is in the technical, business development and external affairs?
Yes, that's correct.
We see a little line coming off the dotted line, and we see technical advisory committees, TAC, and other advisory committees. Does that indicate that you or your department or your directorate is advised by technical advisory committees?
Not exclusively. I think the dotted line relates to the relationship because the sort of policy around the technical advisory committees is operated out of the technical team, but there is a link across into operations, most definitely, and the advice that is provided by those advisory committees is very much directly fed into operations.
I see. And I think it was your evidence that you and operations, your directorate and operations work together on
Yes.
accreditation. Now, just as to the technical advisory committees, can you give us an idea of what sorts of issues the committees might discuss and advise UCAS on?
They will give advice if we need any, if we reach out to them, or if an issue arises that might require us to clarify the general requirements for accreditation, the application of those requirements for a particular sector. So we will consult with them on guidance documents. They will give us advice on the technical competence of the criteria for selecting, that we use for selecting assessors. And they will also keep us connected into the sector as well, through the different types of members that are represented. So it allows I think can increase communication between UCAS and those sectors. So it might be standards making, it might be pending government policy or legislation, for example.
Perhaps what someone might call stakeholder engagement.
Yes, yes.
And am I right that the composition of a TAC could include, as we say, direct customers and indirect customers? Is that fair?
Yes, that's correct.
And they might attend alongside representatives of UCAS, government, regulators, academia, and other institutions. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Now, we've talked a lot about different bodies, the members, the policy advisory groups, and the technical advisory committees. How does UCAS manage impartiality in members of those groups?
In members of...
So, for example, the UCAS members, the policy advisory forum, and the technical advisory committees.
If I take the Policy Advisory Council first, because that is a smaller group to represent the larger group of the forum, we have a sort of an even representation of the members representing, so there is a balanced representation of interested parties in that group. And that council, acting on behalf of the forum, reviews any relationships that UCAS has with any what we call a related body. So if we are to enter into an agreement, perhaps with a scheme owner or a government department, an information sharing agreement, for example, we will do an analysis of any impact on our impartiality, and then we will present that to the council for their review and comment and advice.
Can you just clarify what you mean by related body?
Well, a related body, because UCAS is an independent organisation, any relationship we have with another organisation needs to be very carefully managed and to ensure that our impartiality is maintained. So I'll give you an example. Information about accredited organisations, a lot of that information is held in confidence under the contract, but it might be that a scheme owner may wish to access that information as part of the scheme. And if all parties agree, we can waive that confidentiality and have an information sharing agreement. If we have an information sharing agreement with another party, they will become a related body.
I see. How does, when constituting these groups, for example, the Policy Advisory Council, how does UCAS ensure that all interests are balanced appropriately?
Through the membership, there are 12 seats on the council, and we will ensure that one particular interest doesn't dominate, so there is a balanced representation of interests, which you can see from the membership. So it wouldn't be allowed to be all government departments or all customer groups. There is a balance between those different stakeholder groups. The members of the council are taken from the Policy Advisory Forum, so the forum has the say on nominating the members of the council.
Now, you've provided us with a list of these technical advisory committees. in your first statement on page 12. Can we please go to that? Thank you. And we can see there's a bullet point list, and it starts paragraph A with asbestos, construction industry, engineering, inspection, forensic sciences, and so forth. Do you see that?
Yes.
The second one there was construction industry. Am I right that sometimes this is called Scitac?
Yes, that's correct.
If we go to page 14 of your first statement, at the bottom, at subparagraph B, you say, the role and work of the Scitac is to provide technical advice to UKAS on matters relating to the construction sector. This primarily relates to construction of infrastructure such as highways, bridges, etc., as demonstrated through the TAC membership. And then you give us an idea of what it does. It says its purpose includes providing technical advice on the following: the formulation and review of specific technical criteria to facilitate effective and consistent application of UKAS activities in the field of construction testing, inspection, and product certification. And then we see it carries on. I just want to pause there. First, you say Scitac is primarily focused on infrastructure, bridges and roads and so forth. Now, am I right that historically Scitac has always focused on infrastructure?
I think that's certainly my impression from looking at the records, yes.
Why does UKAS have a construction industry TAC that focuses primarily on infrastructure?
I think as you've seen from the main list of technical committees, technical advisory committees, it's not an exhaustive list of all of the different activities that UKAS is involved with. So the technical advisory committees have tended to sort of respond to the needs of the sector. And I think for established areas where there hasn't been a need, I can't account personally for why it wasn't a focus, I think, some years ago. I know now it is a focus for a number of reasons.
Well, we'll certainly come to that. Can we just pause for a minute and would you tell me, UKAS invites people to sit on technical advisory committees, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And that means UKAS at one point decided what specialties and interests would be represented on the construction industry technical advisory committee, doesn't it?
Yes.
And that means at one point UKAS decided that the focus would be on infrastructure. Is that right?
I think that's a reasonable assumption.
And certainly the list of TACs that was in your witness statement, there's no additional body or additional committee that would deal with fire performance testing of building products, is there?
No, there isn't.
And looking back at that, looking at it now, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, would you say that there's a gap in the technical advice that UKAS had access to via these committees?
I think via the technical advisory committees, yes. But I think this is not the only place that UKAS would potentially get advice from. UKAS sits and colleagues sit on a very broad range of different groups, including standards committees, and so there's a number of different ways we have access to our expertise to take advice.
I see. You said earlier that perhaps things might have changed. Do I take from that UKAS has expanded its focus via these committees to include perhaps construction product testing and certification in respect to fire performance?
That is our intention, and I think something that we are starting to look at now. I think one thing that's impacted on that is the current activities around product regulation, construction product regulation, which we're also very closely involved with. the work of the Competence Steering Group post the Dame Judith Hackett review, for example, and all of those working groups. So I think that is the place where we're currently interacting with key stakeholders and following that work very closely to ensure that we take on board any of the outcomes of that work.
Right. Can we go to your first statement at page 16? That's UCAS 20. Thank you. In the bottom half of the page, subparagraph E, we see the question that the inquiry has asked, and it's whether the Scitac has ever advised as to the testing and/or classification of construction product systems with regards to fire performance. And then I think it's your answer immediately below, and it says, from a review of the Scitac records, it appears that Scitac has not provided advice on the testing and/or classification of construction product systems with regard to fire performance. And then you've identified 3 sets of minutes, and we can see at the bottom of the page that they're from 1999, 2000, and over the page we see another set of minutes also from 2000. Now, can we take it from your evidence that these 3 meetings are the only time, as far as your record review goes, that Scitac has ever discussed fire performance testing and classification of construction products?
Yes.
And does that tell us that Scitac has not historically been concerned about that aspect of UCAS's work with the construction industry?
Yes, I think so.
Does it also tell us that for the last few decades, the fire testing of building construction products was not a main topic of interest for UCAS?
I think it would depend what you mean by main topic of interest. I think against the scope of our activities, where we accredit thousands of different activities, I don't think any one is a main one. I think that, but it can, I think, definitely be seen that committee has not dealt with those matters.
Can we say that infrastructure was a higher priority than fire performance testing?
I wouldn't say that it was a higher priority in the sense of, well, only if in terms of the scope of the activity of that committee, there may have been more issues that were considered to be relevant for that committee to deal with.
I see. Now, looking at the minutes of these meetings, you were not at these meetings, that's very clear, but I just want to look at one set of minutes to understand what happens in these committees. Can we go to UCAS 20-10844, please? This is a meeting of Scitac on the 7th of March, 2000. And on page 2, we can see item 4.2. And we see it's regarding European fire testing issues. And we can see that 3 documents were tabled by someone called Dr. Corkish. And from our research, I can tell you that the first one certainly is the Construction Products Directive. The last one relates to consultation on European standards of fire performance, so product testing. And I think over the page 3, there's this minute at the top. Mr. Harris stated that Mr. Key had written to organisation groups who had indicated interest in UCAS Operations Fora initiative, and as a result had met with the fire testing group in January 2000. This meeting discussed whether there were any issues appropriate for inclusion in the Scitac. UCAS is awaiting further information from the group, and it goes on. Now, ultimately, UCAS didn't set up at that time any particular advisory group on fire testing, did it?
I don't know whether we did, because when looking at these minutes, that seems to imply that there is a group, I think. But I've not been able to identify any records.
Yes. Well, I can tell you that the next set of minutes, this was raised and it was decided that no group would be set up. We can go to that if necessary, but this is about the European standards as adopted in the UK. Do you get that from your reading?
Yes, I do.
Now, does UCAS have any role or influence in the content of those standards?
Potentially, we have the opportunity to participate in standards making. We have members of staff who sit on BSI, the British Standards Institution committees, technical committees, as experts where they have that expertise. So we do have a chance to do that through what is put into at that time European legislation. There are also groups for the notified bodies, or there were at the time, which is again another place that these matters I would imagine were likely to be discussed. I've certainly attended, not the construction one, I've attended other similar groups where that is the core topic of discussion.
What is, if any, UCAS's interest in whether European fire testing standards are adopted or used in the UK?
For the adoption of those standards is not for UCAS to prescribe. That will be for a regulator or for policy to call those standards up. The standards that we use for assessing and accrediting bodies do make reference to the use of those standards, international standards, where they exist. So there is certainly an acceptable, but it's not for UCAS to specify the standards that are used.
If I can give you an example, in around this time, the adoption of the EN 13501 classification for fire performance of products, what UCAS would have to accredit products to that standard if adopted. Could that be the reason that UCAS is interested in what how these standards are developing and being adopted?
Well, firstly, we don't accredit products. So we assess and accredit the organisations that evaluate or may evaluate products. So if they are going to utilise those standard methods or standard processes, then yes, they will ask for those activities to be included in their accreditation, and we will assess them.
In order to assess them, to see if they can perform correctly, UCAS would have to have some understanding of what, for example, EN 13501 requires.
That's correct.
Now, you've mentioned international standards. I want to introduce that topic by first asking you questions about how UCAS evaluates itself. And I understand, and you say in your second statement, that UCAS operates in compliance with ISO IEC 17011. Now, pausing there, ISO, I think, stands for the International Organization for Standardization, and IEC stands for the International Electrotechnical Commission. Is that right?
That's correct.
And they jointly publish something called the 17,000 series, I think.
That's correct.
I'm going to just say ISO, but when I say ISO, I mean both bodies. And certainly 17011 deals with accreditation bodies. Is that right?
Yes.
And when UCAS is performing assessments, UCAS itself must meet ISO 17011. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can we go to your second statement, UCAS 2011422, at page 3, please? And you've helpfully listed out some of the coverage of 17011. And we see at 3.3.4, there's impartiality and independence. And just to put that in lay terms, that means UKAS's impartiality, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Now, 3.3.8, for example, we see competent resource. And over the page at 3.3.12, we see, for example, process requirements. And there's a long list of things that UKAS has to do to meet its own international standard. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, we saw reference to UKAS's impartiality in that list. I just want to dwell on that for a moment. You tell us why this matters in your first statement. I'd just like to go to that at page 17. So that's UKAS 2011242 at page 17. Thank you. Paragraph 12, you say, for accreditation to provide confidence to the marketplace, it is essential that it is undertaken impartially and that impartiality of personnel involved in the accreditation process is not compromised by commercial, financial, or other pressures. This is reflected in the UKAS document QMS 1000 UKAS impartiality policy, and we can see that you've exhibited it. In particular, the person making the decision on granting, renewing, extending, or reducing or withdrawing accreditation is always independent of the team that undertook the assessment. So can we take from that that impartiality is very central to the role of UKAS?
Yes.
And you referred to the QMS 1001 policy, your Exhibit 8. Can we go to that at UKAS 2011255? Can we go to the last page, page 4, please? And right at the bottom, we see change history. And it says, it's dated its first issue, 16th of May, 2018, document first published. Was this UKAS's first standalone impartiality policy?
Yes, it was our first standalone document.
Impartiality was a requirement of ISO 17011 before 2018, though, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
How did UKAS ensure its impartiality before this document was created?
Through the policy was, and I think to some extent still is, repeated, and prior to the publication of the standalone policy, was held in our management framework document, which is essentially our quality manual, if you like, and also our accreditation process document, policy and process, policy and requirements document, which is a document we call ACC 1000. And then there's also reference to it in contracts as well with assessors.
Yes. And you've mentioned ACC 1000. Can you just tell us, we will come to it later, but can you just tell us what that is to help the panel?
ACC 1000 is a quite a large detailed document which outlines the process for assessment and accreditation. So it contains the details of the steps involved in the accreditation process and the requirements that we need to meet.
And just coming back to this 2018 policy, can you tell us what prompted UKAS to write a standalone policy on impartiality?
Yes, I can. In 2017, ISO 17011, the standard that we need to meet, was revised. And that document itself sort of reordered the requirements for impartiality. And it seemed a sensible thing to reflect that change in our management system.
Very well. Sir, this is a good moment for a break. Can I ask you both
all right.
now?
Well, that's a good time to take it then. Well, Mrs. Turner, we have a break, as you know, halfway through each session. This is the time to take the break for the afternoon. We'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 20 to 4. And now you've started giving your evidence, I have to ask you not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it while you're out of the room.
Of course.
All right?
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Would you like to go with the usher then, please? Thank you very much. 20 to 4 then, please. Would you ask Mrs. Turner to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mrs. Turner, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Hines.
Thank you, sir. Mrs. Turner, I want to talk now about what accreditation means in a little bit of detail. And I think you can define it as it's where an authoritative body like UKAS formally recognises another body, like a testing laboratory, and it says whether it's competent to carry out a task. Is that a fair working definition for accreditation?
Yes.
Now, in very broad and simple terms, it's not a check on whether a facility got the right answer on anything, is it? Or at least not necessarily.
It's not a check on those individual answers, no.
My understanding is that UKAS looks at how a body operates and how it has systems and safeguards and how it deploys them. Is that right?
That's correct.
And we see in the documents a term called conformity assessment bodies, sometimes called CABs. Can you just tell us, they're the bodies that the UKAS accredits, like, for example, the laboratory.
Yes.
And if I were to give two examples, they might be the Building Research Establishment, BRE, and the British Board of Agreement. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Now, would you describe the bodies as UKAS's customers?
Yes.
And I'm right, these are the bodies that pay for UKAS's services. Is that right?
Yes.
And these bodies enter a contract with UKAS. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that contract is always on UKAS's standard terms. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
I want to just ask you now about how UKAS uses particular international standards to assess these bodies. Can we go to BSI 401726? And this is ISO 17025. And we can see it's called General Requirements for the Competence of Testing and Calibration Laboratories. And this is the version as it was when it was amended in 2006. There's a more recent one. It's been published in 2018. But this is the one that covers the period in which this inquiry is most interested in. So I'll refer to this. Can we go to the main contents page at page 7? We can see that it sets out a number of requirements. I just want to draw your attention to section 4, management requirements. And under that, we have things like organisation, management system, document control. And then towards the bottom at 4.14, we've got internal audits and management reviews. Then under that, we have technical requirements. And again, there's a list of points, which are 5.2 personnel, 5.3 accommodation and environmental conditions. So this gives us a sense of what this standard covers. And is it right that this document is at least one that UKAS will use to decide if a facility can be accredited?
Yes, it is for laboratories, this one.
Yes, specifically for laboratories conducting testing, calibration, as we saw in the front.
Yes.
There are others, and we will come to them later in your evidence, but for a body such as the BRE, who wishes to be accredited to do fire testing, this would be a document that UKAS would use to assess it.
Yes.
Now, I understand that UKAS records exactly what a body is accredited to do on something called a schedule of accreditation. Is that right?
That's correct.
These are publicly available, aren't they?
Yes, they're published on our website.
Can we just go to an example so we get a sense of what they are? We can see one at UKAS 304908. And we can see that at the top, this is for BRE Global Limited. And this is number 78, and it was published on or at least it's dated on the 28th of February 2014. Now, on the left, we see UKAS's testing logo, And underneath that, we can see that it's accredited to ISO 17025. Now, it may be quite obvious, but does this document tell us that as at this date, the BRE was accredited to the standard of 17025 to perform the activities that are listed in it?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, I can tell you this document's 57 pages long. Does that tell us that the BRE had a great deal of activities it was accredited to perform under that standard?
Yes.
Can we go to page 4? And we see a table with 4 columns: materials, type of test, standard specifications, and location. And in the middle of the page, but actually the bottom row, it says fire tests. And if we look at the second one, it says reaction to fire. And in the third column, we can see there 8414 part 1 and part 2. Do you see those?
Yes, I do.
And then towards the bottom, we can find, towards the very bottom, we can see BS 476 part 6 and BS 476 part 7. And is this how we know that on that date, the BRE was accredited by UKAS to perform those tests?
Yes.
And does it tell us that UKAS's view was that the BRE's performance of those tests were at the level as required by ISO 17025?
Yes.
And does it also tell us that the BRE, in UKAS's view, conformed to the other requirements of ISO 17065, for example, impartiality and record maintenance and those management points?
Sorry, you said 17065?
I meant
17025, yes.
That is,
Yes.
I'm absolutely well corrected, 17025. But the rest of my question stands, for
Yes.
example, impartiality and so forth, yes. I want to look now at how UKAS accredits bodies or assesses bodies. Can we go to your Exhibit 11, which is UKAS 2011246, please? This is Gen 1, and it's the general principles for the assessment of conformity assessment bodies by UKAS. Now, does this set out in general terms how bodies should be assessed for accreditation?
Yes, this is the public document, it's the published document that very much mirrors our internal document that I mentioned earlier, ACC 1000.
Yes, is it fair to say it's a slightly more simplified,
Yes.
less detailed document? Now, this one's dated 2021, but would I be right to say that the overall process for accreditation has generally, in broad terms, stayed the same for many years?
In terms of the principle of conducting assessments, yes.
Yes. Can we go to page 13, which has a diagram? And this is what I mean by the general process has largely not changed. From left to right, we see that the body makes an application for accreditation. Then there's a contract review. And it's at that point where UKAS may or may not enter a contract with the body. Is that right?
Not as such, because the contract, we have an agreement which is signed at the start of the process, the UKAS terms. The contract review is sort of language we use to describe our evaluation of their application.
I see.
So we look at the resources that we need, the amount of time,
Yes.
what the request is.
Yes, and if the amount of time is great, perhaps that might affect the fee that UKAS would charge. Or if it were in a new situation, you might need to do a project to be able to accredit if it's a new thing that UKAS hasn't done before.
Yes, well, they're slightly different things, but if at the application stage, if it's an activity that we've already accredited before, we don't need any development activity. We will then proceed, identify the team, identify how much time we believe we need at that point, and then we'll provide a quotation to the organisation.
Right. Just looking at the diagram, the next step seems to be an optional step that's pre-assessment, and that appears to be a paper review of perhaps the likely outcome of an assessment.
It can be a desktop assessment or it can be an on-site assessment.
And then we have at the fourth box, the initial assessment. And I think this is the first formal assessment that UKAS does of the body. Is that right?
For a new, for an organisation that's not already accredited, that would be the case, yes.
And moving across to the right of this diagram, we see the big blue box, which says full assessment and decision making. I'll come back to that in a moment. From that box, we see there's three diamond-shaped boxes, all which have surveillance in it. And I've understood that that means that for the next 3 years, after a decision's made, there's a surveillance cycle. So once a year, UKAS will surveil the body.
Yes, that's correct. Although the first surveillance assessment for a new organisation normally takes place 6 months after the grant,
Yes.
and thereafter every
Yeah. And then at the end of that 4 year, after 3 surveillances, then there's another full-scale reassessment. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, for each assessment, so for a reassessment or for a surveillance, UKAS will prepare a visit plan which sets out what UKAS will be looking at. Is that right?
Yes.
And that will follow something called the assessment programme. Is that right?
Yes, we have an assessment programme for an accredited organisation outlining our plans for covering the scope, which is the list of tests on the schedule, list of activities on the schedule, over the 4-year period.
And at each of these visits, UKAS will usually attend and conduct a physical inspection. Is that right?
We carry out an on-site assessment is the usual process.
Yeah, and possibly in COVID times they might be done remotely.
Yes.
But on the whole, it is the default is there's a physical inspection.
Yes, in fact, we call them, just in terms of sort of language, we call it an assessment, rather than an inspection, really, because we're not just looking at what's happening on the day that we arrive. We're looking at the records demonstrating the organisation's compliance and implementation of its systems prior to the assessment, and also an indication that they'll be sustainable going forward. So the language we use is an assessment.
I will attempt to use that in future. These assessments, they can be with a number of people, so a number of assessors can go to the body to assess. Is that right?
Yes,
not
that's
just
correct.
one person. And they might be specialised people with special technical knowledge and ability. Is that right?
Yes, they will be.
And in advance of an assessment, does UKAS consider documents does UKAS consider documents from the body?
Yes, we do.
Do you ask for those documents in advance?
Yes, we do.
Can you give us an idea of what documents you get in advance?
We may ask for any updates to things like their main processes and policies. Probably a more old-fashioned language is a quality manual, but they're sort of their main policy document. Any technical procedures that we are going to be looking at. We might ask for other records, any key changes, outcome of management reviews, things like that. It will be for the team to decide, how easy it is to look at those things on site.
Yes. And when they're on site, am I right that assessors might do a range of things? For instance, physically witness staff performing technical duties?
Yes.
Reviewing technical records?
Yes.
Inspecting premises or assessing premises and the environmental conditions?
Yes.
And conducting interviews with personnel?
Yes.
Now, there's a term witnessed assessment or witnessing. Can I just explore that for a moment? Does it mean that the UKAS assessor goes to the body and watches staff performing the technique?
Yes, it can do, yes.
So, for example, a UKAS assessor might go and watch a British Standard 476 Part 6 test. That might be on an actual client specimen, is
Yes,
that right?
yes.
It might just be on a mock-up or a leftover sample, is that right?
Yes, it does depend. Ideally, we will see live testing on real samples. But the nature of some tests are that they're not performed that frequently, or they may take place over a number of days, sometimes weeks. So we might see a bit of a sort of maybe something that's been pre-prepared. That's something that will be discussed with the laboratory prior to the assessment and also on the day as well.
Well, that's really my next question. Who decides what UKAS will assess during an assessment?
Every organisation has an allocated assessment manager, who is a permanent member of UKAS staff. They're often a technical person as well, but unlikely to have all of the technical capability for that particular organisation. So they will make will take the lead on proposing the assessment programme. So once the 4-year assessment programme has been developed, they'll use that to plan each individual assessment. They may make some changes for a number of reasons. Perhaps the scope's changed or tests have been removed, for example. But the assessment manager will also work in conjunction with their assessment team. So they will consult the individual experts as to what they would like to see, because they've got the knowledge about what's practical, for example.
What input does the conformity assessment body itself have in planning the assessment programme?
They do not have an input in terms of deciding what we want to look at, but as I've already said, there sometimes are some practical challenges. For example, if there's a test that we particularly want to witness, we may make a separate arrangements to look at that separately on a different occasion. So we need to liaise with the organisation as to what's available.
And if something's on a visit plan but isn't available, what happens then? Is it held over to another visit?
Potentially, if it's not considered to be a risk. But you will also see, and on the example schedule that you showed earlier, some of those tests will be quite similar. So when we're looking at the organisation's competence as a whole, it might not be considered necessary to see every step of every test. If we can read across from one competency that's been demonstrated being equivalent to something else.
I think one of the UKAS witness statements by Mr. John Leadbeater uses the example that 8414 Part 1 is similar to 8414 Part 2. Would that be the sort of thing you're referring to?
Yes.
We saw earlier that the BRE schedule, for example, was very extensive. And, well, perhaps the reality is that conformity assessment bodies perform a lot of services and have a lot of staff and a lot of equipment. Would that be fair? For example, the BRE, just by way of example.
Yes, I'm not sure what your
Well, I'll ask my question. What I'm getting at is UKAS can really only ever see a snapshot of how the body is performing. Would you say that's fair?
In terms of the activities that we witness, I think it absolutely is a sampling exercise. It will be what we see on the day from the witness, but we will also look at records. So sometimes if we're not able to witness, maybe for practical reasons, something that we've put on the assessment plan for that, the visit plan for that year, then we will talk to the staff involved, we'll look at records, we'll do a vertical audit perhaps, which is something where we take a look at the records of a whole life cycle of the job, if you like, from the time the sample came through the doors of the laboratory right the way through to reporting.
Right. During an assessment, an assessor might raise an improvement action. Can you tell us what they are?
Well, when we conduct an assessment, if the assessor identifies something that they believe may not be in compliance with the standard, they will record the finding as a fact. You know, they saw that the equipment record wasn't up to date. They saw they didn't have any validation data for something, so they'll record a finding. When they consider them as they go through the assessment, because you're gathering information. So towards the end of the assessment, the findings will be reviewed and identified if there are non-conformities.
Yes, and when there's a non-conformity identified, does the body have to take some action?
Yes, they do.
And who decides what action the body has to take?
The body decides what action they take in terms of fixing and putting in place preventive measures, understanding what's gone wrong. That is for the body to decide, but they will often propose during the assessment what they'll do, and the assessor might give some feedback at that point, but the decision about what they do is with the body.
Yeah, why is that?
Because it's a really important part of our role to maintain our impartiality, not to give consultancy.
I see. And then when the body proposes an action, then is it up to UCAS to decide if that action is sufficient?
We'll review the evidence, yes.
I've seen a term identifying the root cause in relation to improvement actions. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Can you tell me what that means?
When a non-conformity is raised, we don't just require the organisation to fix the problem, but to understand what led to the problem arising in the first place. So now sometimes that might be a simple thing, in which case a root cause analysis isn't particularly extensive, but it might be that there are some underlying issues or risks that have led to that incident. So we ask them to consider that as part of what we call their corrective action.
Yes. We've spoken about the standard 4-year cycle, but I believe that UCAS can also conduct extra visits and unannounced visits. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I suppose that means what it says, that an extra visit is in addition to the 4-year cycle?
Yes.
And an unannounced visit is one that a body isn't notified of or has very little notification of.
That's correct.
Are they unusual?
They are, in fact, actually, I have had a look to see how many extra visits we've done in the last year or so, and it's of the order of about 120. And in over that time period I looked at, 12-month period, there were 6 unannounced. And if you think, based on the numbers I gave at the beginning of accredited organisations that each have an annual assessment, you can see the sort of proportion.
Yes. I'm not going to do the maths in my head, but we can do that if necessary. But it's a reasonably small proportion.
Yes.
Talking about the impartiality of the body itself, am I right that it's a requirement in at least some of the 17,000 standards, the ISO 17,000 series standards, for the body to be impartial, is it?
There are requirements in relation to impartiality, yes, in the standards.
Certainly in ISO 17025, there's a requirement for impartiality.
Yes.
And in ISO 17065, there's a requirement for impartiality.
Yes.
Yeah. How does UCAS assess a body's impartiality?
We assess it by looking for the presence of objectivity. Is I think a quite a good way of describing it. So we look for evidence, factual evidence of them implementing their procedures, that they're not influenced, that there isn't a bias, that they've got the controls. They also need to understand any potential threats to their impartiality and describe and implement ways in which that they manage those. And of course, those things can change over time potentially. So they need to be continually looking at that.
Well, it might be said that a person, by which I mean a body or an individual, might perhaps even unconsciously have a partiality, and that person might be unlikely to reveal it, particularly if they're not aware of it. How does UCAS assure itself that it's assessing impartiality robustly?
Through, I think, the general processes we have to look at the rigour of our assessments. Impartiality is, and it's similar to integrity, as sometimes quite difficult things to sort of go in and actually say, well, we're going to look at impartiality. You generally find, if there's problems and issues with impartiality, you find an absence of impartiality. You find records that suggest that there has been a bias. So it is, it's not an always easy thing for us to sort of approach with a sort of defined list of things to look for.
Yes. Something that is discovered perhaps in the breach.
Yes, yes.
I want to turn to non-conforming work at this point. Can we go to Gen 1, page 17? So that's UCAS 2011246 at page 17. And this is a very dense document. At the bottom, we see surveillance activities. And if we carry on, so that's the header. If we carry on over to page 18, it says this at paragraph 4.5.2, the conformity assessment body must inform UCAS of any significant changes to staff, resource, including key equipment, technical capability, or any significant complaints and non-conforming work during the year as per the requirements in the UCAS agreement. Now, just about that term, significant non-conforming work, we did ask you about this in your, and you replied in your second statement, which is UCAS 2011422 at page 11, paragraph 8.1. You say, UCAS considers this to be any incident, circumstances, or issues that the CAB identifies or becomes aware of that may affect the customer's ability to comply with the UCAS agreement or to fulfill the requirements for accreditation as set out in its certificate and schedule of accreditation. And just staying with your second statement immediately under that, paragraph 9.1, you say, significant non-conforming work must be disclosed with minimal delay. Routine assessments will include looking at a CAB's non-conforming work process and records of non-conforming work and associated corrective and preventive actions. So we see that there's a reference to the contract terms in Gen 1. Before I ask you any questions, I just want to look at contract terms. Can we go to UCAS 2011302? This is, we can see at the bottom, the February 2016 version of contract terms, issue number 2. Can we go to page 7, clause 3.3? And at the bottom, yes, it says this. The customer undertakes to UCAS to notify it of any circumstances which may affect the customer's ability to comply with this agreement or may otherwise affect or potentially affect the customer's ability to fulfill the requirements for accreditation as set out in its certificate. And then under there is a list. First is any change in its legal, commercial, ownership or organisational status, any order being made for winding up, down to the next paragraph, any action being taken to enforce security. Next paragraph, any changes to its top management or key personnel, any change in its premises, equipment, facilities, resources or working environment, any significant change in its conformity assessment processes, practices or procedures, or any change in its principal business policies. Now, looking at this contract, the term significant non-conforming work, it's not defined in the contract anywhere, is it?
I don't believe so, no.
And it's not in the contract, it's not stated in the contract at all as far as we can tell. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
Mightn't a conformity assessment body reading their contract consider that it only has to notify UCAS if it falls into one of these circumstances of change?
I think this contract wouldn't be looked at in isolation because if the paragraph 3.3 makes reference to this list as including. but actually makes the general point about any circumstances which may affect the customer's ability to comply with the agreement or fulfil the requirements for accreditation.
So it's your understanding that a body would be obliged to notify UCAS of any significant non-conformance or conforming work?
Yes, through this and what it says in Gen 1.
How would, outside of a visit, how would a conformity assessment body disclose significant non-conforming work? Is there a process for that?
There is a process in that they would contact their assessment manager, and these are things that are discussed with the organisation as well. You know, when they first become accredited, and when they have their surveillance assessments as well. So it's not something that's looked at in isolation. There is that ongoing communication between the organisation and the assessment manager.
Very well. Can we go to page 12 of your second statement? That's UCAS 20111422. Paragraph 11.1. And you see the question above that. How does UCAS ensure that the conformity assessment body informs UCAS of significant non-conforming work? And your answer at paragraph 11.1 is UCAS cannot guarantee that CABs will provide prompt notification of significant non-conforming work. Non-conforming work records are reviewed as part of the assessment process, so any failure of the CAB to inform UCAS of significant non-conforming work at the time it occurs is likely to be identified during assessment if it's not been disclosed prior to the assessment. And then you go on to talk about instances where you may receive information from another source, such as a complainant or a whistleblower. Now, do I understand from that records of non-conforming work, or that CABs are required to keep records of non-conforming work?
Yes.
And UCAS reviews them as a part of the regular assessment programme?
Yes.
And does the UCAS assessor review all of the records or just a sample?
It would just be a sample.
Does the assessor evaluate them? So, for example, would the assessor evaluate how serious the non-conformity is?
Yes, they will.
Or how frequently
Yes.
it's occurring?
Yes.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that this system relies quite heavily on the honesty and openness of the CAB?
I think the whole of the ongoing maintenance of the requirements for accreditation falls into that category, and then but we will then look at their performance through our assessments. So we can't guarantee that they will provide the information. I think that would be really difficult for us to do. We have measures in place to encourage them, mechanisms to look at it when we receive it, and sanctions to impose if we find that they haven't been. But they will implement a management system in their organisation, and we will be looking at the effectiveness of that.
Well, they should do, but what happens if there's a significant piece of significant non-conforming work and they decide to cover it up? You don't have a system, as far as I can see at the moment, to examine records and practices over a preceding period to try and spot that sort of problem.
That's when we do our assessment, we will look at records from the organisation, and when you'll look at things like conducting a vertical audit, you'll sample across many different aspects of their system. So there is no guarantee against major sort of fraud or major covering up. I think that would be impossible. But there are many occasions when our assessors will identify, or have many examples rather. It's not, I think, something that's particularly common, that they will find discrepancies that then lead, because perhaps if someone's intent on covering something up, they don't always do it that well. So, we have examples of that. If it's done incredibly well, like a criminal act, there is that potential that it might not get picked up. There isn't a guarantee with this. What it is a look at that the organisation is operating, has evidence that it is operating with integrity. and that it is implementing its system.
All right. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stone, if it's only a sample, and if the conformity assessment body may not report, it is right, isn't it, that non-conformities may never be spotted? I mean, that's got to be right, isn't it?
I think there is that potential, yes, but we're also looking at. I think it's a question of minimising that. As I said, I don't think there is a guarantee that can't happen, but we are also looking at how the organisation manages its own systems and audits, conducts audits or arranges audits to be conducted, and we'll be looking at the evidence that it gathers. So there are many opportunities to identify non-conforming work over and above just their records of non-conforming work.
Right. Can we just staying with your second statement at page 13? Question 14A. We asked you what steps UCAS would require the conformity assessment body to take if UCAS were to find an instance of significant non-conforming work. And you say at paragraph 14.1, the CAB would be required to take appropriate action to investigate the non-conformity, determine the cause, which may include multiple contributing factors, correct the non-conformities, determine the need for further action to ensure that the non-conformities do not recur, determine the actions needed and implement them in a timely manner, maintain records of action and review effectiveness of those actions. Action may include ceasing the conformity assessment activity and informing affected CAB customers if the validity of the output of the accredited activities was impacted. For example, the validity of reported test results. And I want to focus on that last part. Action may include informing CAB customers. Are you saying that UCAS requires the body to take action like informing its own customers that test results might be invalid?
That is one possible outcome of that investigation. So if they identify results that have been reported to be incorrect, then they are required to inform their customers.
How is that enforced by UCAS?
Through any non-conformity that we would raise, and we would then ask to see evidence that they have taken that action.
And when you say evidence, is that how?
Copies of correspondence to the customer, a reissued report.
I see. Now, I'm going to show you some documents which you might not have seen, but I would like your view on them in this context of non-conformity. Can we please go to BBA 50178? And this is an email chain between DCLG and the BBA. The BBA is accredited by UCAS to certify products, isn't it?
Yes.
And as I've indicated, we'll talk about that in more detail later in your evidence. Can we start at page 3, please? This is an email dated 11th of July 2014, timed at 16:40. And we can see it's from Brian Martin, and he's the principal construction professional at DCLG, or was at this time. And it's to John Alban, who at this time was the head of approvals of construction products at the BBA. And Brian Martin says at the second paragraph, "It's come to my attention that BBA Cert 08452-2008 included advice that the product in question satisfied paragraph 12.7 of Volume 2 of Approved Document B. Paragraph 12.7 provides that insulation materials used in external walls should be materials of limited combustibility. It would appear, however, that the product in question is not a material of limited combustibility. I'm also aware that Certificate 08452 has been recently revised and this reference has been removed. I'm concerned that the original certificate may have been issued in error. As this is a serious safety matter, I would appreciate it if you could investigate and advise me of the outcome of your investigation as soon as possible." If we go up to page 2, at the bottom of the page, we see an email from John Alban, dated 16th of July. At the second paragraph, he says, the amendments made on the 6th of April 2010 to Certificate 084582 included a new reference to paragraph 12.7 of Approved Document B. This was not intended to imply that the product was of limited combustibility, and as you have observed, was removed in the subsequent issue, dated 17th of December 2013. The reference to paragraph 12.7 seems to have been an unfortunate and rare oversight that would not escape the internal checks and measures that the BBA currently operate. A review of other certificates has confirmed that this has not been reproduced elsewhere. And if we can go up to the top of page 2, we can see Brian Martin's response. And he says, the second paragraph, for completeness, I wonder if you could confirm a couple of things for me. What has BBA put in place since the original certificate was issued to make you so confident this won't happen again? A summary would be fine. Will you be notifying the manufacturer, certificate holder of the issue? And finally, at the very top of page 1, Mr. Alban responded on the 23rd of July, and he says, this mistake was basically caused by human error. The project manager involved and their line manager no longer work in the BBA's operations department. We are addressing the overall issue in 3 ways. We have introduced a new training program for all staff focusing on both technical and procedural matters. An additional level of checking has been introduced via the new management structure, and we've placed more emphasis on certificate templates, which are commented on by internal and external experts prior to finalising. Now, just pausing there, this error appears to pertain to the description of fire performance of a product in terms of whether it met certain requirements of the statutory guidance, Approved Document B. Would such an error be considered non-conforming work according to UKAS?
It would be considered as non-conforming work, yes.
Would UCAS have expected the BBA to notify it immediately on discovering this?
I would say, without knowing the details, that it would depend, because if it was, it would be for the conformity assessment body to decide or to determine the impact of that non-conforming work, because it would not be practical or appropriate for every change of a report to be reported to UCAS. It absolutely should be reported in their system, and then depending on the root cause of and the impact, if it's all impacting as in accordance with the as stated in our agreement, their ability to continue to meet the requirements for accreditation, then yes.
In circumstances where Mr. Martin has said this is a safety issue, would you not expect UCAS to be informed of this in any event?
I think it depends. I think as I've said before, when reading this email now, looking at and this would just be my opinion of the types of action that they've taken, does suggest more than maybe just an error on that typed the wrong thing sort of thing, because they've suggested retraining. So that maybe implies that there was a problem with the training. But that's just
yes.
My immediate thought, really.
Yes.
The effect of the certificate was that whatever Mr. Alban says by way of seeking to diminish the importance of what it said that a particular product complied with a paragraph of the guidance which required materials of limited combustibility, thereby implying, yes, I think inevitably, that it was a material of limited combustibility when it wasn't. Now, would that count as a significant error?
I think it is a significant error, yes.
Now,
it should have been reported straight away.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Sorry. Yes, thank you.
The next assessment of the BBA after this email, which was July 2014, was in April 2000, I think it's in the next year, in the April. And the assessment report doesn't identify this particular incident as a non-conformity. Now, does that mean that either it wasn't recorded or on the sample the assessor didn't find it?
I don't know. We would expect I think if it had been found, it would have been reported.
Yes.
But that's
Yes.
I would expect.
You've mentioned sanctions as part of the way in which you incentivise bodies to deal within the honour system, as the chair has put it. Those sanctions would include, for example, withdrawing or suspending accreditation, wouldn't they?
Yes, they would.
And they're the primary sanctions, aren't they? There might be increased surveillance or unannounced visits as well. Is that right?
Yes.
Or instead of? Withdrawal or suspension is of accreditation. The body can carry on doing work. It just won't be able to put the UKAS logo on it. Is that right?
They can carry on working as long as there isn't a regulatory requirement for them to be
Yes.
accredited to do
Yes.
that work, yes.
Yeah. And in those circumstances, UKAS will immediately revise the schedules of accreditation to remove anything that they're not accredited to do anymore. Is
Yes.
that right? Yeah. And they'll be published on the UKAS website. Is
Yes.
that right? And is it correct that organisations under sanctions actually have their details published on the UKAS website?
There is a list of organisations, yes, that have had the sanction.
But that list is only for the preceding few months. Is that right?
That's correct.
Why would UKAS only publish the details of those organisations for a limited number of months?
Because all of the schedules, scopes of accreditation are published on our website, and that is a live. You can look at any one time, and that should be the current situation. Sometimes it might take a day or two to update it, but so once a sanction has passed, then the organisations had their accreditation reinstated. So there isn't a history recorded currently on our website.
Right. So if I were wanting to find out historically if a body had been accredited in the past, that would be very difficult for me to find out with the website information as it currently stands. Is
Yes,
that right?
but you can ask UCAS and we will provide the information.
I see. Does UKAS publish details as to why sanctions were imposed?
No, we don't.
Why is that?
Because of the confidentiality arrangements that we have with organisations, which comes from a requirement in 17,011, but we will publish that the organisation has had their accreditation suspended or withdrawn.
Is it up to the sanctioned body to tell customers why it was sanctioned or not at all?
They do have to inform customers any customers where that work is impacted by the sanction.
And does UKAS enforce that?
Yes, we do.
So it's 4:30. I have one more topic to cover, which I think I could probably do in 10 minutes, if I may, or we could pause there.
Yes, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to ask Mrs. Turner to come back on
We will
Monday
certainly.
anyway, won't we?
Yes, that's quite right.
Is the topic very closely related to this?
It does follow on. I will try and take it very quickly if you'll indulge
Do you
me.
mind going on for another
It's fine.
few minutes?
It's fine, no problem.
I want to talk specifically about the case of fraud. And can we go to the policy document, ACC 1000, which we've mentioned earlier? That is at UCAS 20010905. This is the 2012 version. Can we go to page 19? At paragraph 7.2.11, there's a provision that first, it says, there are situations where specific sanctions are required to be imposed by UCAS. And down to the first bullet point, it says, where there is proven evidence of fraudulent behaviour or the CAB intentionally provides false information or the CAB deliberately violates accreditation rules, UKAS shall initiate its process for withdrawal of accreditation. Now, as to what might constitute fraudulent behaviour, would I be right to say it would include falsification of test data or records or deliberately withholding or concealing information? Would that be right?
That's correct.
Would it include concealing records of non-conforming work?
Yes, it would.
And
If they were, yes.
if it were of a serious
Yes.
degree, yes. You mentioned confidentiality, and I just want to bring confidentiality into this, with particular reference to a document that's UKAS 20-10846. This is a set of minutes from a Scitac, Construction Industry Technical Advisory Committee meeting, and it was held some years ago in April 2003. On page 3, item 3.9, we can see there was a discussion about whether there should be an obligation for UKAS to breach confidentiality and bring instances of fraud or safety breaches into the public domain if they are uncovered during assessment. We can see that there was a debate, and Mr. Talbot reiterated that there is no obligation for UKAS to breach assessment confidentiality and bring incidences of fraud or safety breaches into the public domain. UKAS are bound by a confidentiality agreement with each and every customer. And you can see that was debated at some length, but at the end, no further action was considered possible. Now, at that time, certainly UKAS's position seems to have been that even in matters of fraud or safety breaches, UKAS wouldn't bring that information into the public domain. Is that right?
That's what that indicates here.
Yes. Do you understand that to be the position now?
I don't understand that to be the position now, although I think there are a number of sort of steps in that process. If we were to become aware of instances of fraud and safety breaches, I think we would go through a process to determine who needs to know. For example, it might be a regulator in the first instance. It will also depend on what the organisation themselves has done to notify affected parties.
But in circumstances where there isn't a particular regulator and the organisation has not taken any steps, would UKAS take any steps to bring matters of fraud or public safety into the public domain?
Yes, I think we would consider that. I just want to clarify, I suppose, what we mean by public domain, and I think that would, in terms of the scope of the confidentiality agreements that we have with our customers, there is also provision for us to disclose in certain circumstances. So I think that we would take a view on what would be appropriate, and that might not be automatically, say, publishing that on our website.
Might not be.
It might not be.
It might not be public, but do I take from that it might be?
I don't believe we have done that.
Would that be an option?
That. I think we'd certainly consider whether that was appropriate. It would not be our intent to withhold information that put anyone at significant risk.
Would you say that UKAS's current contracts with confidentiality clauses and so forth, would a matter of serious fraud or breach of safety, would that be out with the confidentiality that UKAS agrees with its body?
I think there is provision in the agreement for us to take action.
Very well. So those are my questions for the witness today. I will have to ask her to come back on Monday, though.
Yes, of course. Before we break, are you coming back to this point about notifying the public of
Those are my questions on notification.
Right, well, then I'm just going to ask one. Has anyone taken any steps to give yourself room in your contract terms to publish fraud or safety breaches if you consider it appropriate to do so?
Yes, because we have, in some cases, we have information sharing agreements with regulators where we can pass information directly to the regulator as a matter of course. We have a specific arrangement, and the confidentiality arrangements are waived by the body in those circumstances. We also have a policy in the healthcare area relating to patient safety where we'll take action if under those.
I mean, I ask because it
circumstances.
strikes me that the solution to the confidentiality problem is to change the terms of the agreements, at least for the future.
Yes, or make specific arrangements like the examples that we have. We have, quite a number of examples where we will give information directly to a regulator or to another competent organisation.
All right, thank you very much. Well, we're going to break there for the day. I'm sorry we've got to ask you to come back again on Monday, but I suspect you were prepared for that. So we'll look forward to seeing you again at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. And in the meantime, please take care not to discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone else.
Okay,
All right.
understood. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would you like to go to the usher, please? Thank you, Ms. Hines. 10 o'clock on Monday.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.